In my first life, my brother died in a frozen alley while I held his cold body, helpless and broken in the snow. In this life, I swore off love and its dangerous pheromones forever, choosing survival over sentiment. I am a beta, naturally immune to the primal instincts and biological traps that ruin lives and tear families apart. Or at least I thought I was, right up until he walked into my boardroom. Darius Sterling is an enigma, the most powerful man in the corporate world and the kind of apex predator whose pure aura can bring even dominant alphas to their knees with a single glance. But his terrifying presence had absolutely no effect on me, and in a normal world, that stark refusal to bow should have been the end of our interaction. Instead, my complete immunity turned me into the one person Darius could not force himself to ignore, sparking a dangerous obsession he never saw coming. If you remember Julian's story from our channel, you already know how high the stakes are when powerful men decide to conquer what they cannot control. And if you are new here, welcome to another unforgettable BL Heartstrings story. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now because this time, the man who swore he would never fall in love may have finally met the one person capable of breaking every rule he ever made. Chapter 1. The Unshakable Beta. The mahogany table in the primary board suite was cold beneath my palms. On my left sat Mr. Harrison and Ms. Vansley, the court-appointed independent directors who had spent the last 4 years guarding our family's logistics firm from total liquidation. On my right lay a single black leather binder containing the official corporate seal, the court's release documents, and the deed of full ownership. 4 years ago, we stepped in after your mother was sacked during the investigation to ensure this company wasn't swallowed whole by the Vance family, Mr. Harrison said, his voice measured as he slid the heavy fountain pen across the glossed wood toward me. Today you turn 21, Toby. The trust is officially dissolved. The company is yours. I picked up the pen. The silver barrel felt heavy, cool, and solid in my grip. As I signed my name across the bottom line, a sudden, phantom chill settled over the back of my neck. 21. In my first life, 21 was an age I never thought I'd reach with a smile. In that nightmare timeline, I was 20, nearly 21, when the panic alarm on my vintage watch went off in the middle of a winter storm. I remembered racing through the blizzard to the frozen alley behind the Vance estate, only to find Julian lying motionless in the snow, his blood soaking through his thin shirt, his body already cold. I remembered falling to my knees, clutching his lifeless frame against my chest, and crying out to the pitch-black sky, if any god is out there, please save him. He deserves a second chance. I didn't die that night. I survived, but the trauma shattered whatever innocence I had left. When time snapped backward and I woke up in my 17-year-old body, I thought it was just a foggy, terrible dream. I sat on the sofa, ate roasted nuts, chatty and relieved to see my brother alive, trying to brush off the lingering horror, until Julian walked away from his wedding, stood up to our mother, and later confirmed he remembered the snow too. My desperate wish had pulled us both back 4 years. Julian was safe now. He was living quietly by the coast with Marcus, far away from corporate politics. The Vance family was behind bars, our mother had been removed from the board, and the company had been placed in a neutral trust until I came of age. Now, standing at 21 in this second life, I carried the living horror of that alley with me. It had left me with one unshakable rule: I swore off romantic bonds entirely. I had watched primal instincts, heats, ruts, and scent dominance ruin my family, manipulate my mother, and nearly murder my brother. To me, love was a dangerous liability. Fortunately, nature had given me the ultimate shield. I was a beta. I had no scent glands, no heat cycles, and no biological instinct to bow to alphas or claim omegas. In a world driven mad by primal biology, my total immunity to pheromones was my greatest asset. The double doors of the boardroom swung open without a knock. The room's temperature seemed to plunge instantly. Beside me, Mr. Harrison stiffened so violently his teacup rattled against its saucer. Ms. Vansley let out a sharp, choked breath, her posture locking up as her eyes widened in reflex submission. I didn't need to smell pheromones to know who had walked in. Darius Sterling. He was the newly appointed CEO of Sterling Global, an international conglomerate quietly acquiring transport hubs across the Eastern Board. More importantly, he was an enigma. A biological anomaly so rare that even the most dominant alphas collapsed under their presence. Rumors claimed an enigma's aura alone could force an entire room of executives to their knees without a single word being spoken. Darius stepped into the room, his charcoal coat draped over broad shoulders, trailing 2 intimidated assistants who looked ready to faint. His dark eyes scanned the room, sweeping over the rigid, sweating forms of the independent directors before finally settling on me. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply pulled out the high-backed leather chair opposite mine and sat down. The air in the room grew suffocatingly thick, a heavy, invisible pressure radiating off him in waves. I could see Mr. Harrison's hands trembling violently against the table as his alpha instinct screamed at him to submit. Darius leaned forward, resting his chin on his steepled fingers, his gaze locked onto mine like a predator studying an anomaly. He was waiting for the flinch, the averted gaze, the instinctual tremor. I leaned back in my chair, picked up my glass of water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. Then I set the glass down with a quiet click. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of tension. "Your appointment was scheduled for 3 o'clock. It is currently 2:15. My directors were just wrapping up my birthday handover." Darius's dark brows twitched upward ever so slightly. The heavy, invisible pressure in the room flared higher, a deliberate, aggressive push of Enigma status designed to crush my composure. Mr. Harrison let out a soft groan, gripping the edge of the table for support. I didn't even blink. "If you brought your aura here expecting me to fold on the regional transit contract, you're wasting your time," I continued calmly, sliding a blue folder across the polished mahogany. "I'm a beta. Your pheromones don't work on me, and your status doesn't appear on my balance sheet." Silence fell over the boardroom, absolute, stunned silence. Darius stared at the folder sitting between his hands, then slowly raised his eyes back to mine. The cold, bored arrogance in his expression broke, replaced by something far more dangerous. A slow, sharp smile spread across his lips. "A beta," Darius murmured, his deep voice carrying a low, resonant rumble. He picked up the folder, his dark eyes burning into mine with intense, unsettling curiosity. How delightfully refreshing. He leaned closer across the table, his smile widening. "Happy 21st birthday, Mr. Toby. It looks like our negotiations are going to take much longer than I thought." Chapter 2, The Silence He Couldn't Control. An Enigma is accustomed to entire boardrooms collapsing under his aura, but when Darius Sterling tried to crush me, I did not even flinch. I just asked him to check Clause 4. Now, the deadliest apex predator in the corporate world was discovering that his favorite biological weapon was completely useless against me, and somehow, that seemed to make me the most intriguing person he had ever met. The silence in the suite after Darius's entrance was heavy enough to cut with a blade. Beside me, Mr. Harrison was white as a sheet while rubbing the back of his neck as his body slowly recovered from the residual pressure Darius radiated, and Ms. Vansley looked like she was calculating the nearest emergency exit. Darius, however, simply leaned back in his high-backed leather chair and removed his gloves with slow, deliberate precision, while his dark eyes never left my face. He was looking for something, a tremor, a nervous swallow, or a single bead of cold sweat that would tell him his presence had gotten under my skin, but he found nothing. I clicked my red editing pen, pulled the contract toward my side of the polished mahogany table, and suggested that we dispense with the intimidation. I pointed out that he had not shown up 45 minutes early to wish me a happy birthday. He was here because Sterling Global wanted our Eastern distribution hubs and assumed he could force me to sign away a 51% controlling stake using his Enigma status. Darius tilted his head with a faint, dangerous smirk and called it an efficient strategy, but I shot back that it was only usually efficient, and that he had made 3 critical mistakes. I held up one finger to remind him that our family company weathered a 4-year legal storm and came out completely debt-free. I held up a second finger to note that our coastal shipping licenses were non-transferable without my personal signature, and then I tapped the barrel of my pen against the polished wood and told him directly that I simply did not care about his status. Mr. Harrison made a faint, nervous sound beside me, but Darius did not move a muscle. I continued by pointing out that he could push his aura until he was blue in the face, but it would not change the fact that his proposed valuation was 12% below market rate. When Mr. Harrison choked out my name in panic, Darius raised one long, sharp-looking hand, and the director immediately fell silent. Darius's attention remained locked entirely on me as his eyes narrowed slightly, testing me once again with a quiet, lingering pressure. In my first life, I had held my brother's cold, lifeless body in a frozen alley, so an invisible push in a warm boardroom barely qualified as uncomfortable. Darius could make everyone else in this room tremble, but he could not make me bow. Darius repeated the figure, his voice dropping into a low, resonant rumble as he leaned forward into my personal space. He asked what would happen if Sterling Global offered 5% above market rate in exchange for joint operations on the coastal routes. I did not back down an inch, replying that I would consider a non-exclusive partnership, but that the controlling stake remained at 51% with me, period. I closed my black leather binder and stood up, buttoning my suit jacket before instructing him to get a revised draft to my desk by Friday. I turned toward the independent directors and announced that we had our private luncheon scheduled. I had barely reached the double doors when Darius's voice stopped me. The tone had shifted entirely. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, lingering confusion when he murmured that I did not smell like anything. I turned back slowly and raised an eyebrow. Darius explained that every room he entered was loud, with alphas challenging him and omegas submitting, filling the air with fear, sweat, defiance, or submission. He rose from his chair to his full, towering height and took a slow step toward me, stopping just outside my personal space. The physical difference between us was stark, but his aura still meant nothing to me. Darius paused and searched my eyes with unreadable intensity before softly adding that standing next to me was completely quiet. I straightened my jacket and replied that it was called being a beta, and that I did not bring biological drama to work. For the first time, something close to genuine amusement touched his features as he whispered that I brought something much rarer, real composure. I almost laughed, but kept my expression strictly neutral because I knew better than to mistake curiosity for respect. Powerful men often called something refreshing right before deciding they wanted to own it. I had seen it happen before, having watched powerful people turn love into possession and biological bonds into suffocating cages until my brother paid the ultimate price for one. I would never allow anyone to do that to me. I held his gaze and told him to keep his next draft as clean as his aura if he wanted to do business. Then I walked out and left the apex predator of the corporate world standing alone in the silence I had given him. I didn't know it then, but my refusal to react to Darius Sterling had made me the one thing he couldn't seem to ignore. Chapter 3: The Quiet Room. The penthouse on the 85th floor was dead silent, illuminated only by the muted amber glow of the city skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass. Darius Sterling stood by the window, swirling a crystal glass of aged scotch as he watched the lights below. In the world Darius had been born into, true silence was a myth. Growing up in the Sterling estate, a household governed by ruthless old-money alphas, life had been a relentless war of biological dominance. Every room felt like a battlefield, thick with the invisible language of fear, aggression, challenge, and desperate submission. Then came his rare Enigma presentation during his teenage years, and after that, the surrounding noise only grew louder. At 27, Darius sat at the very top of the food chain, untouched, unchallenged, and entirely isolated. People did not see Darius Sterling, the man. They saw an Enigma, an apex predator whose presence could bring an entire room of executives to their knees without him saying a single word. Until today. Darius took a slow sip of his drink and replayed the 2:15 meeting in his mind. He had walked into that boardroom fully expecting to crush a green 21-year-old CEO. He had intentionally released enough Enigma pressure to make seasoned alpha directors choke on their own fear, anticipating panic, averted eyes, and eventually a trembling hand signing away controlling shares. Instead, Toby had calmly taken a sip of water, adjusted his folder, and told him to check the contract. Beta. Darius's fingers tightened slightly around his glass. Toby carried no biological scent, no fear, no submission, and no challenge. There was nothing for Darius's instincts to interpret, only the faint tobacco floral perfume lingering against his skin and clothes. Standing near Toby had not felt like standing beside anyone else. It had felt like stepping out of a roaring hurricane and into a perfectly quiet room. It was a scent void. For the first time in years, Darius's instincts had found absolutely nothing to fight, dominate, or decode. And strangely, he had not found that absence irritating. He had found it intoxicating. Toby had not cared about his status or his biological power, and he had not looked at Darius and seen an enigma. He had simply evaluated the executive sitting across the table and found his proposed valuation lacking. Darius caught his reflection in the dark glass of the window, noticing that the bored, cold mask he had worn for years was gone, replaced by a slow, genuine, and dangerous smile. His phone buzzed softly against the marble counter, displaying a message from his lead legal counsel asking if they should proceed with the formal hostile takeover of the eastern shipping routes. Darius did not hesitate as he picked up the phone and typed a direct reply, instructing them to draft a 5% above market joint partnership offer instead, non-exclusive, with Toby retaining his controlling stake. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before he added another message, telling his executive assistant to find out Toby's preferred tea blend. He paused, remembering the casual way Toby had mentioned his birthday, saying his directors were just wrapping up his birthday handover as though it were nothing important. Darius typed again, ordering a bouquet of ghost orchids to be placed on Toby's desk tomorrow morning to mark his 21st birthday. The response came several seconds later with a simple confirmation, and Darius locked the screen to set the phone back on the counter. He took another slow drink before turning his attention toward the sleeping city below. Toby believed his beta immunity would make Darius lose interest and that his composure would make him walk away, but Toby had misunderstood one important thing. Darius had spent his entire life surrounded by noise, fear, submission, challenge, and desire, where every room was loud and every person reacted. Then, without warning, a 21-year-old beta had walked into his world and given him something he had never known existed, which was quiet. The meeting had ended hours ago, yet Darius was still standing there, replaying every word Toby had said, remembering the slow, deliberate sip of water, and seeing those steady eyes looking back at him without fear. Darius Sterling was not a man who became distracted easily, but for the first time in years, he found himself wondering what the quiet room would feel like tomorrow. He looked down at the lights of the city and smiled again, knowing that while the meeting had ended in that boardroom, his interest in Toby Vance had only just begun. Chapter 4: The Sound of Survival. My phone vibrated against my nightstand just as the sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across my bedroom. I picked it up, pressed it to my ear and leaned back against my pillows, exhaustedly loosening my tie after a long day of preparation. I mumbled into the receiver that if he was calling to tell me I was officially old, he could save his breath. A low, familiar laugh came through the speaker, warm, crisp, and blessedly alive, as Julian softly wished me a happy 21st birthday. I could hear the faint crash of ocean waves in the background, followed by a sudden metallic clatter as Julian yelled for Marcus to put the cast iron down before he dropped the whole ribeye on the dog. A muffled, indignant shout from Marcus echoed down the line, making me laugh into my hand. Julian apologized for him while sounding thoroughly amused, explaining that Marcus was attempting dinner duty before adding that turning 21 was especially a big deal for us. The room grew quiet for a beat because neither of us needed to spell it out. 4 years ago, in that dead timeline, 21 was the birthday I spent holding his cold body in a frozen alley. Hearing his voice now, teasing Marcus over dinner by the coast, made the last lingering ghost in my chest finally rest. I sat up and told him that I signed the final trust release papers yesterday, that the company was officially mine, and that I could finally put our plans for the business into place. Julian told me softly that he had never doubted me for a second, his voice full of pride. Then he paused as his elder brother radar went off, noting that I sounded like I had been running on coffee all day and asking if someone had given me trouble at the handover. I ran a hand through my hair and chuckled dryly, knowing that no one knew me better than Jules. I explained that Sterling Global had tried to pull a fast takeover move and that their CEO crashed the meeting before the ink was even dry. Julian's tone shifted, the easygoing warmth sharpening as he warned me to be careful with Darius Sterling because men like him were used to walking into a room and having everyone bend to their will. I stretched and told him that Darius had strutted and trying his usual intimidation tactics to make the directors sweat and expecting me to hand over 51% of our transit routes. Julian asked what I did and I told him I took a sip of water, informed him his offer was 12% below market value, and handed him a red pen. Julian let out a sudden loud burst of laughter that made the speaker buzz, wishing he could have been in that room to see me shut down a 27-year-old billionaire titan. I chuckled, leaning back, and mentioned that Darius looked completely baffled and made a weird comment about me being too quiet before I walked out on him. Julian warned me affectionately that men like Sterling were not used to hearing the word no, and that if aggressive tactics did not work, he would find another angle. I promised him I would not drop my guard, reminding him I did not rewrite our lives just to lose now, and told him to go rescue his dinner before Marcus set off the smoke alarm. Julian laughed, admitting it was too late because Marcus already had, and after a quick exchange of affection he hung up. I lowered the phone and stared at the ceiling for a moment, remembering how for years I had imagined what it would feel like to hear Julian's voice on my birthday without ever imagining it would still make my chest ache with gratitude. He was alive and that was enough. The next morning, I stepped out of the executive elevator onto the top floor of headquarters, my suit jacket buttoned and my guard firmly back in place. When I pushed open the double doors to my private office, I froze. Sitting in the center of my desk was a sleek, unbranded wooden box polished to a high shine, and beside it lay a sealed cream envelope with my name written in sharp, elegant calligraphy. I walked over, set my briefcase down, and opened the wooden box first to find 12 glass vials of small-batch loose-leaf white peony tea. It was my tea, the rare, non-aromatic blend I used to drink late at night when the company's legal battles were at their worst, which was a private preference I had never mentioned to anyone on the board. Beside the box sat a carefully arranged bouquet of ghost orchids. I stared at the tea for several seconds, knowing there were very few people who knew that preference and fewer still who would have thought to remember it. Darius had known me for less than 24 hours, which should have been impossible, yet somehow he had found it. My gaze shifted to the orchids, and I reached toward one of the delicate flowers before stopping myself. It was beautiful, and that annoyed me because I had the distinct feeling Darius Sterling had just learned something about me that I had never intended to reveal. I picked up the cream envelope, broke the wax seal, and read the letter wishing me a happy 21st birthday. The note explained that the revised draft for the Eastern Transit route had been restructured as a joint operation with my controlling stake kept firmly at 51% and valued 5% above market rate, exactly as requested, with no leverage and just good business, signed by DS. I stared down at the crisp paper, my fingers tightening slightly around the heavy cardstock. He had not sent some loud, extravagant corporate gift or tried to impress me with his wealth. He had sent an exact business compromise, my favorite tea, and a bouquet of rare flowers, proving that he had listened. That was what unsettled me. Darius Sterling had realized force was useless, and now, instead of pushing harder, he was speaking my language. I looked down at the ghost orchids again, realizing Julian had been right. Darius Sterling had found another angle, and somehow, that was far more dangerous than his aura ever could have been. Chapter 5. The Quiet Refuge. The boardroom of Sterling Global was usually Darius's primary battleground. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he had already engineered 3 hostile takeover bids, reorganized a European supply chain, and forced a rival Alpha CEO to back down from a regional bidding war. He sat at the head of the dark obsidian conference table, surrounded by 6 senior vice presidents arguing over projected quarterly margins. The air was thick with tension, sweat, and aggressive corporate posturing. Normally Darius loved this. It was what he lived for. He thrived on parsing weak arguments, unleashing enough oppressive presence to silence a room, and bending the market to his will. Except today he could not hear a word they were saying. His eyes drifted down to his desk clock, which read 2:14 p.m. Every time he tried to focus on a financial document, his mind involuntarily slipped back to yesterday's meeting. He kept seeing 21-year-old Toby taking a quiet sip of water, tapping a red pen against the mahogany, and casually handing a 27-year-old Titan his own failure on a silver platter. Darius pinched the bridge of his nose and exhaled slowly, trying to focus, realizing that while he was the undisputed Titan of the Eastern Board, the only thing occupying his thoughts was whether Toby had opened that polished wooden box of white peony tea. His chief legal strategist broke his train of thought by asking if they should give the signal to execute the liquidity clause by 3 to lock their rivals out of the bidding cycle entirely. Darius stared at the strategist for 2 long seconds as the noise in the room, the nervous tapping of pens, the suffocating spike of anxious alphas, and the desperate need for his approval, felt suddenly and unbearably deafening. He stood up abruptly, buttoned his charcoal suit jacket, and announced in a flat, absolute tone that they were rescheduling the acquisition vote for tomorrow morning. When the lawyer blinked in disbelief and mentioned their 3:15 closing deadline, Darius simply reiterated that he said tomorrow, declared the meeting adjourned, and stepped away from the table without waiting for a response, leaving his entire management team frozen in bewildered silence. 10 minutes later, Darius stepped out of the executive elevator onto the top floor of Toby's corporate headquarters. Toby's assistant hurried toward him, clearly caught off guard, trying to explain that his boss was not expecting him, but Darius walked past him and pushed open the heavy double doors to Toby's private office. The moment the door shut behind him, the contrast hit Darius like a physical wall as the noise of his entire world instantly evaporated. There was no oppressive scent of fear, no desperate posturing, and no heavy biological chaos, but rather just silence and a complete scent void filled only with the faint, clean aroma of warm white peony tea. Toby was sitting behind his mahogany desk, wearing thin-framed reading glasses as he annotated a ledger. On the corner of his desk sat a steaming glass mug of tea, half empty, beside the signed partnership contract. Toby looked up, completely unbothered by the sudden intrusion, without jumping or changing his expression. He simply removed his reading glasses, set them on the desk, and told Darius flatly that his assistant had not informed him he was coming and that he should not barge into his office without an appointment. Darius did not move right away. He closed his eyes for a single second, letting the utter stillness of the room wash over his frayed senses before walking toward the desk. He leaned his hands against the mahogany edge, released a genuine relaxed breath for the first time all day, and murmured that no one told him because he had not planned it and that his team was currently looking for him. His dark eyes met Toby's as he admitted that he just needed 2 minutes of peace and quiet. I stared at the 27-year-old billionaire leaning against the edge of my desk, my mind briefly stalling. I might have been hardened by the memory of a dead timeline, and I certainly was not in the business of handing out free favors to corporate predators, but I was not a cruel person either. Standing there with his eyes half closed, Darius Sterling did not look like the ruthless titan who had tried to corner my board 48 hours ago. He looked genuinely and deeply exhausted, like a man who had been drowning in noise for years and had finally found a pocket of air. I leaned back in my chair, picked up my intercom phone, pressed speed dial, and asked my assistant to bring a fresh pot of chamomile tea and a second glass mug to my office right away. Setting the phone down, I gestured toward one of the leather armchairs facing my desk and told Mr. Sterling to sit down because he was making my office look like a crime scene. Darius opened his eyes with a faint trace of surprise crossing his dark features before pulling back the leather chair to sit down, unbuttoning his charcoal suit jacket, and sinking into the cushions with a long, quiet release of tension. With the corporate hostility stripped away, I allowed myself to actually look at him for the first time, realizing Darius Sterling was absurdly attractive with sharp aristocratic features, a razor-precise jawline, dark intense eyes, and broad shoulders filling out his bespoke suit with effortless elegance. In any other situation, a man who looked like that would have been an absolute heartbreaker, but fortunately, I had no interest in giving anyone the chance to break mine. Watching what Guy Vance had done to Julian in that former life had taught me enough about love, as I had watched affection become manipulation, devotion become possession, and a marriage become a cage, making me build my life around ensuring I would never enter one of those cages myself. A soft knock sounded at the door and my assistant stepped in, setting a silver tray with a steaming glass teapot and 2 mugs on the corner of my desk before quietly slipping back out. I poured a cup of the amber liquid and pushed it across the mahogany toward Darius as the soothing floral scent of chamomile rose between us, blending with the quiet hum of my office. Darius brought the glass to his lips, took a slow sip, and asked about the chamomile in a low, smooth voice as his long fingers wrapped around the warm glass. I replied flatly that it helped with stress and told him to consider it a courtesy for signing the 5% above market draft so promptly. Darius set the mug down and looked at me over the rim, his dark eyes searching my face with that same intense, unreadable curiosity that kept my guard firmly up, before murmuring that I was an unusual person. I met his gaze without a single flinch and replied smoothly that I was just a guy running his company. I glanced at the clock, reminded him that his 2 minutes of quiet were ticking away, gestured toward his tea and told him to drink his tea. Chapter 6: The Unwritten Strategy. Darius returned to his office with a strange sense of calm, and the executives in the corridor noticed it immediately. Normally, when Darius Sterling walked through the 85th floor, conversations stopped, assistants straightened, and senior managers suddenly remembered meetings they had forgotten to prepare for. Today was different. Darius barely noticed them as he stepped into his executive office, closed the heavy door behind him, and stood silently behind his desk. For once, the constant biological noise in his head had gone silent, having evaporated in Toby's office during those 2 brief minutes. That was all it took, 2 minutes sitting across from a young man who had looked at him without fear, without fascination, and without the slightest interest in treating him like the most powerful enigma in the city. Toby had simply looked at him like a man. Darius sat down slowly, his gaze settling on the sprawling city skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling glass, though his thoughts remained fixed on that mahogany-paneled office across town. The name Toby brought an unexpected warmth to his chest. Darius had spent most of his life solving problems with cold, calculated strategy. If a company stood in his way, he acquired it, if a competitor challenged him, he outmaneuvered them, and if a negotiation failed, he changed the terms until it succeeded. Everything had a solution except this. He wanted to see Toby again, not because of a contract, a transit partnership, or merely because Toby's presence quieted the biological chaos that had plagued him for years, but simply because he wanted to see him. Darius leaned back in his leather chair, letting the realization wash over him, which should have unsettled a man who lived by total control, but instead made him smile. He reached for the desk phone and dialed his personal concierge directly, speaking quietly once the line picked up to request a standing delivery arranged for ghost orchids. There was a brief, surprised pause before the concierge asked how many arrangements were needed, and Darius clarified one, every Tuesday and Thursday for Mr. Toby. When asked if a corporate card should be attached, Darius declined, reaching into his top drawer to pull out a sheet of heavy cream stationery and stating he would write the notes himself. He ended the call, uncapped his fountain pen, and stared at the blank paper for several seconds. A strange thing happened then, as Darius Sterling, a man who could negotiate billion-dollar acquisitions without blinking, found himself thinking far too carefully about 4 simple words. He finally wrote that there were no agendas, just something quiet, before adding his initial beneath it. He set the pen down, knowing that was enough for now because he knew better than to rush a man like Toby. Whatever walls that 21-year-old had built around himself had been built for a reason, and Darius had no intention of trying to break them down. He wanted Toby to open the door himself. His phone was still resting on the dark mahogany desk, so Darius picked it up and stared at Toby's contact information for a long moment before typing a message acknowledging that he owed him for interrupting his afternoon, inviting him to join him tomorrow evening with no boardrooms or contracts, just a walk through the botanical glasshouses. He almost deleted the final sentence, but instead added an invitation for 2 minutes of quiet, extended. Darius pressed send, watching the message disappear from the screen, and for the first time in 27 years, found himself doing something no corporate strategy had ever taught him to do. He sat back and waited. Chapter 7. Cracks in the Armor. The ghost orchids arrived on a Tuesday morning without extravagant wrapping, an enormous ribbon, or any of the excessive displays I had come to associate with wealthy men trying to make an impression. There were simply 7 pristine stems arranged in a clear glass vase, their delicate petals resting beside my morning coffee as though they had always belonged there. Attached to the glass was a small cream envelope that I did not need to open to know who had sent it. I picked up the card anyway, my eyes immediately settling on the sharp, deliberate calligraphy that somehow looked exactly like Darius himself, reading, "No agendas. Just something quiet. D." I stared at those few words longer than I cared to admit, realizing Darius Sterling had somehow managed to send flowers without making them feel like a declaration of ownership. He had not chosen roses with their heavy fragrance and obvious symbolism, nor had he sent some extravagant arrangement designed to announce his wealth from across the room. He had chosen something restrained, elegant, and quiet. He had listened, and that realization unsettled me more than the flowers themselves. I set the card down carefully and reached toward the nearest blossom, running one finger along the smooth edge of a petal while something small and unfamiliar stirred beneath my ribs. The sensation lasted barely a second before every instinct I had built over the past 4 years immediately raised its walls, reminding me not to do this. I had spent 4 years rebuilding my life piece by piece, learning that independence was not loneliness but protection, having watched Julian get destroyed by a man's charming promises and seeing firsthand how easily affection could become manipulation when the wrong person discovered where your weaknesses were hidden. Love was not safety, love was leverage. At least, that was what I had taught myself to believe. I told myself I was not going and that I did not have the time, yet when 7 o'clock arrived the following evening, I was standing outside the towering glass arches of the city's private botanical gardens, staring through the illuminated entrance at the warm greenery beyond. I had made one condition very clear when I accepted Darius's invitation. 1 hour, no contracts, no business, and if he crossed a boundary I would leave. This was my choice, or at least that was what I kept telling myself. Inside the main glasshouse, the temperature was warmer, and the humid air carried the faint sense of soil, leaves, and climbing vines as I stepped onto the winding stone path beneath a canopy of tropical greenery. Darius was already waiting, not wearing his suit jacket, with the top button of his dark dress shirt undone and his sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows, removing the rigid corporate polish that usually surrounded him like another layer of armor. His dark hair was slightly unstyled, as though he had run his fingers through it rather than allowing an assistant to make every strand perfect. Without the immaculate suit and commanding presence of the boardroom, he looked less like the city's most intimidating enigma and more like a man who had simply come to meet someone he wanted to spend time with, an unfairly handsome man, a thought I immediately resented. He turned when he heard my footsteps against the stone path, a warmer light passing through his dark eyes before settling into the faint, genuine smile that seemed reserved for moments when we were alone. He murmured softly that I had come, and I replied, keeping my hands tucked into my coat pockets, that he had offered quiet, and as a CO, I did not turn down good offers. A faint smile touched the corner of his lips as he said he would consider himself fortunate, and he did not tease me about hiding behind business language, earning him another point I did not want to give him. We began walking side by side along the winding brick path, surrounded by towering ferns and quiet hanging vines. For once, there were no security officers following several steps behind us, no reporters waiting outside the gates, no board members calling for updates, and no assistants hovering nearby with tablets full of contracts and schedules. There was only the soft hum of the greenhouse misting systems, the occasional whisper of leaves shifting beneath the ventilation, and the quiet rhythm of our shoes against the brick. For several minutes, neither of us said anything, then 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 20, and somehow the silence never became uncomfortable. Darius did not attempt to fill it with business discussions, nor did he ask about contracts or negotiations, and he did not use the opportunity to interrogate me about the things I had carefully avoided discussing. He simply walked beside me, matching his longer stride to mine without making me feel as though he was deliberately slowing down, a small detail that shouldn't have mattered, but did. Eventually, I glanced sideways at him and asked why he chose this place. Darius looked toward the trees ahead and explained that it was the only place in the city where he could hear himself think, continuing after a moment to share that after he presented as an enigma, silence became almost impossible because everywhere he went, he could feel what everyone else was feeling: fear, aggression, submission, desire, and even when people said nothing, their instincts were screaming. He looked at me then, noting that it was like that until he walked into my office. Something inside my chest tightened as I reminded him he said he needed 2 minutes, to which he agreed, leading me to point out that now he had brought me here. He answered simply that 2 minutes were not enough, catching me off guard with the sheer honesty of his reply, free of any seductive smile or calculated confidence. We continued walking until we reached the center of the conservatory, beside a quiet stone fountain surrounded by broad-leafed plants, where Darius stopped. The amber garden lights reflected softly across his dark eyes as he studied my face with an attentiveness that made me suddenly aware of every inch of space between us. He lifted his hand, then stopped, his fingers remaining suspended between us for the briefest moment, giving me every opportunity to step backward, turn away, or tell him not to. I did none of those things. His fingers brushed gently against my shoulder before settling against the collar of my coat, and with surprising tenderness, he straightened the fabric where it had folded inward, the touch feeling warm, careful, and almost unbearably gentle. He murmured that I looked tired, not stressed, but just carrying a very heavy weight. My breath caught as I looked up at him, and suddenly the entire greenhouse seemed quieter than it had a moment earlier, with all I could hear being the uneven rhythm of my own heartbeat, which was not driven by fear, and that was what frightened me most. It was warmth. For one dangerous moment, I forgot every reason I had ever given myself for keeping people at a distance, because Darius was not trying to break down my doors, demand that I lower my defenses, or use his power to force his way through the walls I had built. He was simply standing outside them, waiting. I managed to say I was fine, though my voice sounded considerably less steady than I wanted. Darius watched me for another moment, but he did not challenge the lie, slowly lowering his hand instead. As his fingers withdrew, something strange happened. Darius froze. His expression changed for the briefest fraction of a second, his dark eyes sharpened, and he inhaled quietly. I frowned and asked what was wrong, and he looked at me, appearing genuinely confused for the first time since I had met him. He claimed it was nothing, but I narrowed my eyes, pointing out that he had hesitated. When I asked why, his gaze lingered on me for another second before he shook his head, admitting he thought he caught something. My stomach tightened as I asked what it was, but Darius looked almost frustrated with himself, saying he did not know before stepping back to give me space again and telling me to forget it. I should have pressed him, but instead I let it go. As we resumed walking, however, I could not shake the strange feeling that something had just shifted between us that neither of us understood. After a moment, Darius suggested in a tone returning to its easy warmth that we get some dinner. No work talk, no contracts, and no negotiations, just food. I looked at him, trying to understand how a man who had built an empire through control could somehow be so patient with me, remarking that he was making an unusually generous offer. He replied that he had his moments, earning the smallest smile from me, which Darius noticed without commenting, somehow making the smile last a little longer. We walked out of the greenhouse together and into the cool evening air, and as we approached the waiting car, Darius opened the door for me without a word. I paused before getting inside, knowing my rules were clear, my boundaries were clear, and my fortress was secure, as I had spent years making certain of that. But as I looked at Darius standing patiently beside the open door, I could not escape the unsettling realization that perhaps the problem was not that he was trying to break through my defenses. Perhaps the problem was that, for the first time, I was not sure I wanted to keep the gates closed. And somewhere behind us, beneath the warm glass roof of the conservatory, Darius was still wondering what he had sensed when he touched me. For the first time in his life, the Enigma who could identify every biological signal in a room had encountered something he could not identify at all, and neither of us knew what it meant. Chapter 8. Proof of Loyalty. The late-night emergency session at Sterling Global's downtown annex was supposed to be a routine finalization of the joint transit expansion, but instead, it had dragged into the late hours as several senior executives attempted to renegotiate terms they had already agreed to. At the center of the friction sat Harrison, a senior board member whose open bias against betas and executive leadership had been a quiet problem since the partnership began. Darius sat at the head of the dark marble table, resting his chin lightly against his steepled fingers as he observed the room. His expression was impassive, but his gaze remained fixed on Toby, who sat across from him, quietly picking apart Harrison's arguments with the same calm precision he brought to every negotiation. Toby was composed, precise, and entirely unbothered by the posturing around him, using clear facts to prove why his company's independence was non-negotiable for the joint venture's success. Harrison, visibly irritated at being systematically outmaneuvered by a beta in front of his peers, finally abandoned any pretense of professionalism. He leaned forward across the dark marble, deliberately invading Toby's personal space in an attempt to assert physical dominance, sneering in a heavy, patronizing tone that they should speak frankly. Harrison declared that while Toby ran a respectable middle-market firm, this was Sterling Global, and in a room like this among real power, betas were there to execute strategy rather than dictate it, demanding Toby sign off on their adjusted terms or watch them route around his network without him. For a fraction of a second, Toby's fingers tightened around his reading glasses. It was not fear in his eyes, but a quiet, tired stillness, the look of a man who had spent his entire career being told he did not belong in rooms built by overbearing alphas. Before Toby could address the insult, the atmosphere in the room shifted completely. Darius did not raise his voice, nor did he make a dramatic scene. He simply straightened in his leather chair, leaning forward just enough for the sheer, unquestionable weight of his Enigma presence to settle over the table. The shift was absolute. Across the table, an executive's expensive pen slipped from rigid fingers, clattering against the marble before rolling to a dead stop while no one reached to pick it up, leaving every person in the room holding their breath in the sudden, suffocating stillness. Harrison's confident expression faltered as Darius turned his dark gaze directly toward him and told him smoothly, with a low, steady voice laced with absolute finality, that he would address Mr. Toby with the respect his position demanded, or he would leave the room, hand in his resignation by midnight, and be removed from the project entirely. Harrison swallowed hard, trying to explain that he was only clarifying the hierarchy, but Darius interrupted softly. Darius declared that Mr. Toby was an equal partner in the venture rather than a subordinate, emphasizing that his company's infrastructure was the foundation of the expansion and his leadership was the only reason Sterling Global was involved. He added that if Harrison disrespected his standing again in public or private, he would consider it a personal insult, asking directly if he understood, to which Harrison sharply lowered his eyes and apologized. Darius held his gaze for one final second before gently easing the pressure in the room, letting the tension lift almost as quickly as it had arrived. Turning his attention toward Toby with a quiet nod of encouragement, Darius asked him to continue with his terms and please proceed. Toby cleared his throat, adjusted his reading glasses, and murmured his thanks before looking down at the documents in front of him for a moment. I had expected Darius to protect the contract, but I had not expected him to protect me, and that distinction unsettled me. I had spent years learning how to defend myself, and after everything that happened to Julian, I had made independence into something almost sacred. I did not need anyone to speak for me, and I certainly did not need an alpha, or an Enigma, standing between me and someone trying to undermine my authority. But Darius had not spoken for me, had not taken control of the meeting, had not told Harrison what I was capable of, and had not tried to finish my argument for me. He had simply made one thing unmistakably clear: I belonged at that table. And somehow, that meant more than I wanted it to. I lifted my eyes from the documents and found Darius watching me without any triumph in his expression, no expectation of thanks, and no smug satisfaction at using his power to silence someone on my behalf. He was simply waiting, giving me the room to continue. Drawing a slow breath, I turned back toward the presentation screen, noting that regarding the Eastern distribution schedule, my voice came out steady and stronger than before. As I continued presenting, I realized something that frightened me far more than Harrison's insult. For the first time since Julian's death in that other life, I did not feel completely alone in the room. Darius remained silent throughout the rest of the presentation, neither interrupting nor interfering, but simply listening. Every time my eyes drifted across the table, Darius was already looking back at me, not as a dominant force demanding submission, but as a quiet anchor making sure I knew I was safe. When the final slide disappeared from the screen, Darius leaned back in his chair and praised the excellent work, to which I closed my folder and offered my thanks. Their eyes met across the table, neither man looking away, and somewhere beneath Toby's carefully constructed defenses, something small shifted. It was not surrender nor love, not yet, just trust. And for a man who had sworn never to let anyone close enough to hurt him again, that was already dangerous. Chapter 9, The Man Behind the Empire. The call came through on Thursday afternoon while I was still processing the lingering aftermath of the boardroom meeting. I answered expecting another regional manager or legal consultant, but when Darius's voice came over the line, surprisingly low and stripped of its usual corporate resonance, I went still. There was something hesitant beneath it, an almost vulnerable edge that caught me completely off guard. He explained that he just wanted to check on me and ask how I was, leaving me momentarily at a loss for words. Then he cleared his throat softly, inviting me to his estate for a quiet afternoon to review the final signed annexes away from the office, asking if Saturday would work for me. I hesitated for a second, my usual instinct telling me to suggest a neutral coffee shop or keep things strictly within business hours at the annex, but the quiet sincerity in his voice made the refusal catch in my throat, and I replied that Saturday worked. Now, as the smooth ride in the back of Darius's private car carried me up the long stone driveway on Saturday evening, my mind replayed that brief conversation over and over. 4 years, every room I entered had required me to be fully armed with data, immovable logic, and a sharp perimeter, as I had learned early that if I let my guard down for even a second, people like Harrison or Guy Vance would try to tear through everything I had built simply to prove that they could. Darius had not torn Harrison apart to claim dominance over the room, though. He had done it to protect my standing. He had drawn an absolute boundary around my dignity, handed the floor back to me, and allowed me to finish what I had started, before waiting 2 days to call and invite me into his personal world without pushing, demanding, or expecting anything in return. When the car finally slowed, the estate came into view, revealing that it was not the cold, hyper-modern glass monument I had expected from an Enigma. Nestled into the tree line was a sprawling stone residence surrounded by quiet gardens, with warm light glowing softly from its tall, multi-paned windows. The driver stepped out to open my door, announcing gentle arrival, and I climbed out into the crisp evening air while pulling my coat closer around myself. Darius was already walking down the wide stone steps to meet me, having shed his suit jacket with his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar and his sleeves rolled to his forearms, looking far less like the ruthless CEO of Sterling Global and more like a man waiting for a guest he genuinely wanted to see. Darius thanked me for coming in a voice low and smooth in the quiet evening air, noting that while he knew I could have easily mailed the signed annexes, he wanted me to see this place. I replied that it was no trouble, adjusting my glasses out of habit as we walked toward the heavy oak doors and adding that a quiet environment was welcome after the week we had endured. The interior was warm, high-ceilinged, and filled with dark wood, heavy bookshelves and soft amber light, with no assistants rushing around or phone consoles blinking with urgent calls, but rather just a profound, restful stillness. Darius led me through the main hall toward the back of the house, where a massive glass conservatory opened into a dimly lit indoor garden rich with damp soil, lush greenery, and the faint fragrance of night-blooming jasmine. I admitted while stopping beside a row of deep green ferns that I did not picture him as someone who kept a greenhouse, and Darius offered a small smile that reached his eyes. He explained that when daily life consisted of people trying to read every move or yield to an aura, plants were a relief because they did not posture or care about rank. They just grew if given care. He walked toward a low stone table where several potted orchids rested, picked up a pair of small pruning shears, and without hesitation bent over one of the plants to carefully trim away a dry leaf before gently settling the exposed roots deeper into the soil. I watched him in quiet fascination, as seeing a man who commanded billions of dollars and carried enough biological authority to bring a room full of alphas to their knees calmly working with his hands in the dirt felt almost surreal. There was no arrogance in him right now, no performance, but just Darius. I leaned back against the edge of a wooden bench and remarked quietly that I built my company because I had to, explaining that in my position, if you do not build your own walls, people like Harrison or Guy Vance will walk right over you. Darius set his tools down, wiped his hands on a soft towel, and turned toward me without stepping into my space or releasing his aura, standing there steady and quiet. He acknowledged gently that I had to fight for every inch of respect I had but pointed out that I did not have to keep my guard up every second of the day when I was with him. My fingers tightened inside my pockets as I met his eyes while my heart began beating faster, clarifying that it was not just a guard but safety. I explained that rules made sense to me because my whole life, whenever someone powerful offered to help me or take care of something, it came with strings attached and expectations of something in return. Lowering my eyes, I admitted I thought he was being nice because I was easy to be around, did not give him a hard time, and did not demand things from him. Darius stared at me for a long moment as something quiet and almost painful passed through his expression, asking softly if that was really what I thought he saw when he looked at me, a convenient arrangement, to which I murmured that it was what made sense and what I was used to. Darius did not argue. Instead, he made a small gesture toward the adjacent room, where a dark grand piano stood beside a curved window overlooking the evening lawn, and invited me inside. We walked into the music room, set our portfolios on a small side table, and rather than opening the route annexes, Darius walked toward the piano and sat down on the leather bench. For a moment, he simply rested his hands lightly over the keys before taking a slow breath and beginning to play a melody that was not loud or dramatic, but quiet, soulful, and heavy with something he had apparently never found the words to say. I stood holding my glasses as I watched the tension slowly disappear from his shoulders, and suddenly I understood. Darius Sterling had spent his entire life surrounded by noise, fear, submission, challenge, and desire, where everyone reacted to him, wanted something from him, feared something about him, or tried to prove something against him. Underneath the billion-dollar empire and the authority he carried every day was simply a man who was deeply lonely, a man who had reached out to me not because he wanted to take something from me, but because perhaps for the first time, he had found someone with whom he could simply exist. When the final note faded into the quiet house, Darius lifted his hands from the keys, looked up at me with a completely open gaze, and stated in a steady, deeply earnest voice that he did not want anything from me. He assured me that he did not expect me to owe him anything, would never ask me to change who I was for him, and did not defend me on Thursday because he wanted something in return, but because he cared about me. He paused, adding that he just wanted the chance to show me that I could trust him. I stood looking at him as the armor I had worn for years suddenly felt fragile, not broken or gone, but no longer as impenetrable as I had believed. For the first time, I did not see a threat, a debt, or a trap waiting for me to make one careless mistake. I just saw Darius. And perhaps that was the most dangerous thing of all, because for the first time since I had watched my brother die in my arms, I found myself wondering what it would feel like to stop surviving long enough to let someone in. Chapter 10, Choosing Him. The silence after the final piano note lingered between us, but for the first time in my life, quiet did not feel like a prelude to a demand, it just felt still. I looked at Darius sitting on the piano bench, his long fingers resting idly near the ivory keys as he watched me with open, unhurried patience. Every defense mechanism I had perfected over the years, the rigid boundaries, the mental inventory of leverage, the reflex to retreat behind my identity as a beta who did not belong in an alpha's world, seemed to weaken beneath the sheer weight of his honesty. He was not waiting for me to surrender. He was waiting for me to choose. I took a slow breath and stepped away from the piano's edge, confessing softly that I was terrified before I could censor the words. Darius did not move toward me or try to close the distance himself, keeping his hands still as his dark eyes tracked every movement I made with complete focus while he asked what I was afraid of. Clarifying that it was not him, I took another deliberate step closer until I was standing beside the leather bench, then removed my reading glasses and set them carefully on the polished piano. I explained that I was not afraid of his standing, his rank, or what people said he was, but rather what happens when I stop holding up my own walls, having spent my entire adult life survival budgeting every piece of trust one hand out, making letting someone in feel like handing over the keys to the company. Darius replied immediately in a low, steady murmur in the dim music room, telling me to keep them. He explained that he did not want ownership of my life, my submission, or my dependence, nor did he want to run my company or manage my peace, softening his gaze as he added that he just wanted to be part of it. The words settled somewhere deep inside me, making me realize how for years I had confused needing no one with being safe, having watched Guy Vance turn control into protection and possession into love until Julian had nearly disappeared beneath both, while Harrison wanted dominance disguised as hierarchy. But Darius simply stood at the border I had drawn around my life and asked for permission to enter, and somehow, I knew he would turn away if I asked him to. I did not say no. Reaching out, my fingers trembled slightly as I rested my hand against his shoulder, feeling him solid, warm, and real beneath the fine fabric of his shirt as I whispered that I did not want to be in survival mode anymore. Darius looked up at me, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something almost uncertain pass through his dark eyes as he asked if I was sure, a question that mattered not because he doubted himself, but because he was making sure I did not doubt me. Clear and unshakable, I answered yes, sliding my hand from his shoulder to the nape of his neck and leaning down to close the final fraction of space between us. When my lips met his, the world outside Darius's estate seemed to disappear in a kiss that was slow, tender, and a question answered without either of us needing to speak. Darius released a low, shaky breath against my mouth before his hands rose gently to my waist, not pulling me down or forcing me closer but simply holding me there as though giving me every opportunity to change my mind. I did not, kissing him again as the warmth between us deepened naturally, carrying every quiet moment that had led us here. The white peony tea, the protected boardroom, the 2 minutes of silence in my office, the flowers without demands, and the late-night calls that had somehow become part of my routine. His thumb brushed softly against my side, sending a quiet shiver through me without any biological instinct forcing me toward him, no pheromone bond and no alpha command, just me choosing him. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads rested together in the quiet room while our breaths mingled in the soft shadows, Darius's hands remaining gently at my waist. Voice thick with emotion as a faint smile touched his lips, Darius whispered that there were no invoices and no conditions. A real laugh escaped me, the kind I had not realized I had been missing until it was already leaving my chest, as I whispered back that there were no conditions. For the first time in my life I was not guarding my perimeter, but standing exactly where I wanted to be. That did not mean all my fears had disappeared, nor did it mean trusting someone would suddenly become easy. But for tonight I was not choosing survival, I was choosing him. And with Darius's arms around me, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps those two things no longer had to be opposites. Chapter 11. The Promise. The courtyard of the Sterling estate was quiet in the early evening, cooled by a gentle breeze carrying the rich, sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine and crushed rose petals. Soft amber light from the hanging glass lanterns flickered over the stone floor, casting a warm glow over the handful of loved ones gathered, Julian, Marcus, and those who knew how much blood, silence, and patience it had taken to reach this moment. Darius stood at the altar, the fine wool of his dark tailored suit smooth beneath his palms as he adjusted his cuffs, his pulse drumming a steady heavy rhythm against his ribs. For the first time in his life, the suffocating static weight of his Enigma aura was entirely gone, replaced by a profound restful stillness. When the oak doors at the end of the stone walkway opened, Darius's breath hitched in his chest as Toby walked toward him with an easy, unhurried grace. The crisp charcoal fabric of his suit caught the lantern light, his reading glasses tucked into his breast pocket, and his shirt collar open just enough to reveal the column of his throat. But what struck Darius most was the sheer openness in Toby's expression. No guarded postures, no rigid shoulders, and no perimeter held up against the world. When Toby reached the altar, the crisp evening air gave way to the subtle warmth radiating between them as Darius reached out, his large, calloused fingers closing around Toby's hands. Toby's skin was cool against his own, his grip surprisingly firm, and his pulse fluttered gently right beneath the surface where their wrists met. Darius tightened his hold slightly, feeling the reassuring weight of Toby's hands in his as he murmured softly that he did not need a speech, explaining that he had spent his whole life surrounded by noise, demands, and expectations. He shared that Toby had given him peace without asking him to earn it and had given him his trust without letting anyone force his hand, promising to protect his freedom, honor his strength, and stand by his side for every year they had left. Toby's fingers twined deeper between Darius's, the warmth of his hands spreading through Darius's palms as a soft, breathless smile broke across his face, tracing fine, familiar lines around his eyes. Toby replied in a steady voice, the smooth cadence of it grounding Darius like an anchor, that he had spent years holding up walls because he thought love meant giving up who he was, but Darius had proved to him that real love does not take, it builds, adding that he chose him today, tomorrow, and everywhere after. When they exchanged the bands, the cool, solid weight of the brushed platinum slipped over Toby's knuckle, seating itself perfectly against his warm skin. Darius pulled Toby close, his arms sliding around Toby's waist, feeling the firm living heat of his back through the fabric of his jacket. When their lips met, sealing the vow, it was not a desperate take. It was slow, deep, and lingering as Toby melted into the embrace, his fingers sliding up to rest against the back of Darius's neck with the soft brush of his hair tickling Darius's skin while they breathed each other in. Later that night, the estate settled into an absolute, serene dark. In the master suite, moonlight washed across the dark hardwood, catching the cool draft slipping through the cracked terrace doors. Toby sat on the edge of the vast mattress with his jacket discarded on a nearby armchair and his tie undone, hanging loosely around his unbuttoned collar to expose the soft skin of his throat and chest, looking up as Darius approached with clear, steady eyes tracking every movement in the dim room. Darius sank to his knees between Toby's legs, resting his large, warm hands over Toby's knees where he could feel the slight tremble in his legs, not from fear but from the raw, heightened tension of what was about to happen. Darius leaned up, pressing a gentle lingering kiss to the inside of Toby's right knee as Toby let out a quiet shudder. Darius asked if he was sure, pointing out that once an Enigma marks a partner, the shift in his biology is permanent, meaning they would not just be husbands in name, their systems would intertwine completely. Toby reached down, his fingers sinking into Darius's dark hair as his thumb trailed over the sharp curve of Darius's cheekbone in a warm, deliberate, and deeply grounding touch, replying that he had never been more sure of anything in his life and asking Darius to mark him. Darius stood, gathering Toby up in one smooth motion as Toby let out a soft gasp as his boots left the floor, his arms wrapping tightly around Darius's broad shoulders with his chest pressed flush against Darius's warm torso. Darius laid him back onto the cool silk sheets, coming down over him and supporting his weight so he would not crowd him. The air in the room thickened, filling with the rich, comforting scent of their bond, smoky vetiver, dark amber, and the clean, distinct warmth of Toby's skin, as Darius buried his face in the crook of Toby's neck, inhaling deeply, his stubble brushing gently against Toby's collarbone and sending a ripple of butterflies across Toby's skin. Toby arched up slightly, his hands gripping Darius's forearms and feeling the hard muscle beneath the fabric as he whispered his name. Darius trailed slow, reverent kisses up the column of Toby's throat, feeling the rapid, frantic beat of Toby's pulse beneath his lips before pausing right at the sensitive juncture between neck and shoulder, his warm breath fanning over the bare skin. He waited, giving Toby one final heartbeat to breathe as he felt Toby's ribs expand and contract against his chest, until Toby tilted his head back into the pillow to expose his throat completely, his fingers tightening in Darius's dark hair to pull him down while whispering for him to do it. Darius parted his lips and bit down, his fangs piercing the skin with sharp, precise pressure. A sudden, breathtaking surge of heat ignited beneath Toby's skin, causing him to let out a low, shuddering gasp as his fingers clutched tightly at the sheets. It was not simply pain, it was a golden, overwhelming rush of connection, deep and unmistakably real, as Darius's biology gently rewrote the quiet baseline of his beta system. Every nerve ending flared to life, humming with Darius's scent, Darius's strength, and a deep, biological peace that settled in his chest like an unshakable anchor. For 21 years, Toby had lived inside a quiet biological world where no alpha instincts had ever reached him, no pheromones had ever commanded him, and no primal pull had ever told him whom he should want or where he belonged. Yet even now, as the Enigma mark settled beneath his skin, Toby knew the most important truth had not changed. He had chosen this and he had chosen Darius. Darius held him close, wrapping his arms fully around Toby's torso and pulling him so flush against his body that their hearts beat in exact, heavy sync against each other, as though the rest of the world could disappear and he would still remain exactly where he was. He soothed the bite with slow, hot licks of his tongue, kissing the tender, sensitive mark over and over until the sharp heat dissolved into a lingering, comforting ache, before pressing his lips gently against Toby's temple and whispering to ask if he was all right. Toby opened his eyes, looking up at the man holding him. Once, he had believed love was a trap waiting to close, and that trusting someone meant surrendering the pieces of himself he had fought so hard to protect. But lying there in Darius's arms, with his husband holding him without demanding anything more, Toby finally understood what Julian had found in this second life and what he himself had spent years running from. Love was not supposed to erase you. The right kind of love gave you somewhere safe enough to remain yourself. Toby smiled and rested his cheek against Darius's broad chest, listening to the deep, steady rhythm beneath his ear as he whispered back that he was all right, feeling Darius's arms tighten securely around him. Outside, the Sterling estate stood silent beneath the moonlight. For the first time, silence was not the absence of fear, nor was it loneliness or the frozen emptiness of an alley where Toby had once held his brother's cold body and sworn that he would never allow himself to need anyone again. This silence was warm. This silence was chosen. This silence was home. And as Toby closed his eyes beside the man he had finally chosen to trust, he knew that in this life, he had not merely saved what was left of his family, he had found something worth living for too. Chapter 12. The noise ends. The morning light filtering through the high arched windows of the estate was soft, catching the gentle haze of dust motes dancing over the dark hardwood. The house was quiet in the way it always was now, not an uneasy, guarded silence but a rich, resting calm. Darius stood by the wide glass doors leading out to the conservatory, holding a warm mug between his hands as he looked out over the gardens. 6 months had passed since the night of the ceremony, and 6 months since the permanent bond had anchored itself into their lives. The static that had buzzed incessantly in the back of Darius's mind for over 30 years, the invisible pressure of every alpha, beta, and omega vying for leverage or buckling under his aura, had vanished completely. It did not just quiet down when Toby was near. The bond had permanently settled his Enigma biology into an unshakable, centered warmth. Behind him, soft footsteps padded across the rug. Darius did not need to turn around to know it was Toby. The subtle scent of dark amber and clean linen washed over him a second before Toby leaned his forehead gently against Darius's shoulder blade, wrapping his arms around Darius's waist. Toby murmured with a sleep-thick voice that Darius was up early. Darius set his mug down on the side table, turning in Toby's hole to wrap his arms securely around him, pulling Toby flush against his chest as he rested his chin on top of Toby's messy hair and replied that he was just enjoying the quiet. Toby let out a soft breath against Darius's collarbone, his hands resting flat against Darius's back as they let the steady rhythm of their breathing sink together. Then, gently, Toby stepped back just enough to look up into Darius's eyes. There was a strange, bright, nervous energy in Toby's clear gaze, an expression Darius had not seen on his face since the early days at the annex. Brows pulling together in immediate concern, Darius smoothed his hands down Toby's arms and asked if everything was all right or if something was wrong with the quarterly expansion. Toby explained that the expansion was fine, letting out a small, breathless laugh that immediately eased the tension in Darius's chest. Reaching into his sweater pocket, his fingers hovered for a second before he pulled out a small, sleek clinical reader and pressed it gently into Darius's palm, sharing that he had gone to see the medical team at the central clinic yesterday afternoon. Darius looked down at the display where the clean digital readout was clear, bold, and undeniable. Permanent bond adaptation. Active, pregnancy confirmed, 4 weeks. Darius stared at the words, the world around him slowing to a complete standstill. In rare cases when an Enigma marked a beta partner, the deep biological rewrite did not just align their nervous systems. It adapted the beta's core physiology to carry life. It was exceptionally rare, a quiet miracle reserved only for bonds formed out of absolute, unforced choice. Darius lifted his eyes to Toby, his usual stoic composure completely dissolving into pure, unadulterated awe. His breath hitched, his fingers tightening around the small device before he carefully set it aside and cupped Toby's face with both hands. Voice trembling in a way no board member, executive, or rival had ever heard in his entire life, Darius whispered Toby's name and asked how he felt. Toby answered softly that he felt safe, leaning his cheek into Darius's warm palm as tears of genuine joy caught the morning light in the corners of his eyes, adding that for the first time in his life, he was not afraid of the future and that they were going to build a real home together. Darius pulled Toby into his arms, holding him so tenderly and fiercely that not a single inch of space remained between them. He buried his face in the crook of Toby's neck, kissing the small mark near his collarbone over and over, feeling the quiet, steady beat of 2 hearts, and the faint, miraculous promise of a third, pulsing against his chest. 3 years later, the late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the estate's lower lawn. I stood on the stone steps of the conservatory, carrying a tray with 2 glasses of iced tea, watching the 2 people who made up my entire universe. Darius was sitting on the timber bench near the edge of the gardens, a simple leather portfolio resting closed beside him. He wasn't reviewing route annexes or checking market projections. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, his posture relaxed, and his dark eyes were fixed entirely on the grass. A second later, our 3-year-old son Leo, with his dark, unruly curls and sharp gray eyes, charged across the lawn, shouting excitedly for his papa to look how fast he could run, his small boots kicking up loose leaves. Darius laughed, a deep, rich sound that still sent a warm shiver straight to my core, and opened his arms just in time to catch Leo mid-stride, lifting him effortlessly onto his lap. Leo giggled, burying his face in Darius's shirt before pointing excitedly back toward me. I walked down the steps toward them, feeling the cool autumn breeze against my skin. The sharp, defensive armor I had worn for years, the constant, exhausting need to protect myself from a world that viewed betas as disposable, was completely gone. In its place was a quiet, unshakable peace. I set the tray on the low stone table and sat beside Darius, leaning into his side as he rested his arm over my shoulders. "He's been running laps around the greenhouse for 20 minutes, I noted with a fond smile, watching Leo attempt to stack acorns on his father's knee. Darius slanted a warm, dark look toward me, his thumb tracing a slow circle against my shoulder as he replied smoothly that Leo got his persistence from me. I laughed softly, resting my head against Darius's chest, listening to the calm, steady beat of his heart. For 4 years, I had believed that safety meant keeping my walls high and my gates locked. I had believed that an Enigma was a storm to be survived. But as Darius squeezed my shoulder, his aura wrapping around me like a warm, protective mantle, I knew the truth. The noise had finally ended. I was no longer running, no longer hiding, and no longer afraid. I was home. Toby nudged Darius's shoulder with his own before leaning in to press a brief kiss against his cheek. Their son immediately climbed into Toby's lap, snuggling against his chest as the afternoon air began to cool. Darius reached out, his long fingers brushing over the back of Toby's hand before intertwining their fingers, the cool, familiar edge of Toby's platinum band resting against his skin. For a while none of them spoke, they did not need to. I looked across the gardens, watching our son laugh as Darius quietly listened to him explain something with the absolute seriousness only a 3-year-old could possess. And suddenly, without warning, I remembered another life. A frozen alley, snow beneath my knees, and Julian's cold body in my arms. For years, that memory had followed me everywhere. It had been the reason I rebuilt my life so carefully, the reason I learned not to trust easily, and the reason I believed survival meant never giving anyone enough power to destroy me again. But Julian was alive now. Marcus was alive. And I was here. I looked down at the hand intertwined with my own and then toward the man beside me. Darius, my husband, my choice. I had once believed changing the past was about preventing tragedy, but sitting beneath the golden evening light with my family beside me, I finally understood that saving what I loved had never been the whole purpose of my second life. I had been given the chance to live one too. Darius looked over, catching my expression, and asked quietly what I was thinking about. I smiled and said it was nothing, to which Darius raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. Leaning against his shoulder, my smile widened slightly as I murmured that it was everything. Darius's expression softened, his fingers tightening gently around my hand. Looking out over the quiet gardens, with the warm weight of his family resting beside him, Darius felt the last lingering ghost of his old life slip away into the breeze. He had spent decades believing power was meant to be held like a weapon and that isolation was the inevitable price of being an apex enigma. He had been wrong. He had not needed power to control the room. He had just needed Toby to teach him how to listen to the silence. And Toby, who had spent his first life believing love could only destroy what he touched, finally understood something too. The right kind of love did not ask him to surrender himself. It gave him a reason to come home. The noise had finally ended. And in its place they had found home. Thank you so much for sharing Toby and Julian's story. It has been an incredible narrative journey to help bring to life, full of emotional depth, intense world building, and a truly powerful, well-earned ending. To everyone listening, if you enjoyed following this story, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below letting us know where in the world you are listening from. Your support means everything, and we'd love to hear your favorite moments from the series. Stay tuned for more stories ahead.